Tonight, we journey into a past so dark, it feels like a nightmare. A time when a woman's most profound tragedy, the loss of a child she yearned for, became her greatest shame. Imagine the crushing grief of miscarriage, only to be followed by whispers, accusations, and the chilling verdict. You were told you were flawed, cursed, or worse, maybe, just maybe, this isn't a horror story. For millions of women in medieval Europe, this was the terrifying reality. We're about to uncover the twisted logic, the bizarre medicine, and the cruel theology that led an entire society to blame women for miscarriages. What you'll discover will challenge everything you think you know about the past. The methods they used to diagnose the cause, the punishments they inflicted, and the psychological torment they endured are more horrifying than any fiction. But here's the truly unsettling part. Some of these dark echoes, these shadows of blame, still linger with us today, hiding in the quiet corners of our modern world. Let the world outside fade away. We are about to pull back the curtain on one of history's most devastating secrets. And if this journey into the past moves you, if it makes you think, then I invite you to become a part of our community of curious minds. Help us keep these important stories alive by weaving your thoughts into the comments below and tapping that subscribe button. Your support is the light that allows us to explore these dark corners of history together. The seed of blame, medicine, magic, and misconception. Picture a small, muddy village in the heart of 14th century England. A woman named Eleanor, married to the village blacksmith, is 6 months pregnant with her first child. She has followed every rule, every piece of folk wisdom passed down through generations. She prays daily at the church, averts her eyes from the lame and the blind. Fearing their misfortune could mark her unborn, she dutifully wears a special amulet, a piece of dried toad skin blessed by the local priest, meant to ward off evil spirits that prey on pregnant women. But one frigid morning, she awakens to a sharp, twisting pain and the horrifying sight of blood. The dream she carried within her is gone. Eleanor will be met with empathy, with a quiet understanding that up to 1 in 4 known pregnancies ends in loss, often due to complex genetic reasons completely beyond anyone's control. But this is not our world, a world where nothing happens by chance. Every event, from a failed crop to a stillborn child, is a message, and the cause is almost always sin. Before Eleanor's physical pain has even subsided, the whispers begin to slither through the village. She must have angered God. Did she laugh too loudly at the harvest festival? I saw her glance at the moon during her monthly courses. Perhaps she had an impure thought about the handsome stable boy. Or the most terrifying whisper of all, perhaps she made a pact with the devil. What passed for medicine in the Middle Ages was a bizarre and dangerous cocktail of ancient Greek philosophy, Christian dogma, and raw superstition. The doctors of the time, and we must use that term loosely, were university-trained men who had likely never witnessed a birth. Their knowledge came from dusty texts written by other men, creating a closed loop of ignorance that had devastating consequences for women. The foundational text for women's health was a collection of writings known as the Trotula. While credited to a female physician from Salerno, historians now believe it was largely compiled or written by men. Considered the height of medical science, offered some truly wild explanations for miscarriage. It claimed a pregnancy could be lost if a woman danced too vigorously, as the rhythmic motion could shake the fruit from a vine, seen as a potential danger. Laughing too hard was thought to agitate the womb. Even witnessing a solar eclipse was considered a cause for miscarriage, forcing pregnant women into shuttered rooms during astronomical events, shrouded in fear and darkness. But these were the benign explanations. The most respected medical authorities, deeply influenced by the church, taught a much darker theory. Miscarriage was divine punishment for sexual sin. And they weren't just talking about adultery. Any sexual thought, any desire that wasn't purely for procreation, was considered a stain on a woman's soul that could corrupt her womb and kill her child. Imagine the psychological torture. In a society where women had no say in who they married, no control over their own bodies, and a complete lack of understanding of their own biology, they were condemned for the very human desires that were a natural part of their existence. The treatments offered were often more dangerous than the conditions they were meant to cure. The go-to remedy for nearly every ailment was bloodletting. A woman who had previously miscarried would be subjected to regular bleeding, either with leeches or a crude knife, to balance her humors. The prevailing theory, inherited from the ancient Greeks, was that the body contained 4 fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Women were considered naturally cold and moist, and miscarriage was often diagnosed as an excess of corrupt humors. Draining their blood, it was believed, would purify their system. A woman already physically weakened and emotionally traumatized by pregnancy loss was subjected to a procedure that made her even weaker, increasing the likelihood that any future pregnancy would also fail. It was a vicious, deadly cycle of blame and harm, prescribed by the most educated men of the time. The sacred curse, religion, and the control of women. The medical ignorance was terrifying, but it was just one piece of the puzzle. The true engine driving the culture of blame was something far more powerful and pervasive, the absolute control of the Catholic Church. In the medieval mind, science and religion were inseparable. The body was not just a biological machine. It was a spiritual battleground, especially her womb, was the front line in the cosmic war between good and evil. The Church taught that all women were daughters of Eve, the original sinner who brought death and suffering into the world by disobeying God. They preach, carried the stain of Eve's sin within her. Pregnancy was her one chance at redemption, an opportunity to emulate the Virgin Mary and bring a new Christian soul into the world. But this sacred duty was also a terrible burden. A successful birth was a sign of God's favor, but miscarriage was seen as proof of that inherent ancestral corruption bubbling to the surface. The most influential theologians of the age solidified this belief. A foundational figure in Western Christianity wrote that women's bodies were inferior, flawed versions of the male ideal, naturally prone to sin and failure. St. Jerome declared that woman was the devil's gateway. This wasn't just abstract theological debate. It formed the very foundation of the legal and social order. A woman who miscarried could be legally charged with murder if there was any suspicion she had caused it intentionally, whether through action or sinful thoughts. The burden of proof was placed entirely on her. She had to prove her innocence in a system that was designed to presume her guilt. Think of the impossible position. To prove she hadn't sinned, she would have to submit to humiliating public confessions, describing her innermost thoughts, her dreams, and the intimate details of her marital life to a male priest. Any deviation from the ideal of the pious, submissive woman could be twisted into evidence against her. The system was even more organized. Official miscarriage investigators, often older midwives co-opted by the Church, would be dispatched to examine a woman's body in her home after a pregnancy loss. They would search for signs of witchcraft, such as hidden herbs or strange symbols. They would interrogate the grieving woman, looking for any hint of sexual impropriety or unnatural behavior. These examinations were invasive, terrifying, and designed to strip a woman of her last shred of dignity. The tragic irony is that the very people who possessed genuine, practical knowledge about women's bodies, the midwives and herbalists who had learned through generations of hands-on experience, were increasingly demonized. Their wisdom was dismissed as pagan superstition, or worse, as evidence of witchcraft. Meanwhile, the male physicians, with their theories based on pig anatomy and ancient texts, were elevated as the sole arbiters of truth. The cures they prescribed were a testament to this blend of religious fervor and medical fantasy. A grieving woman might be told to make a grueling pilgrimage to a distant shrine while pregnant with her next child. She might be instructed to drink wine mixed with the powdered bones of a saint, or wear a dead man's finger as an amulet. One of the most sought-after remedies was powdered unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk sold at astronomical prices to desperate families, enriching merchants who preyed on their fear and grief. Perhaps the most heartbreaking consequence of this system was how it destroyed female solidarity. In a world where a woman's greatest comfort should have been her mother, sisters, and she was taught to be suspicious of them, a neighbor's jealous glance could cast an evil eye and curse your womb. A friend's envy could cause your milk to dry up. Even your own mother, with her knowledge of traditional herbal remedies, might be a secret witch. It was a deliberate strategy of control. By isolating women from each other, by turning them into objects of mutual suspicion, the patriarchal system ensured they remained powerless, dependent, and unable to challenge the forces that oppressed them. From sin to sorcery, the witch hunts and the womb. The blame placed on women was primarily spiritual. A miscarriage was a sign of your personal sin, a punishment from God. It was a source of immense shame and social stigma. But in the late Middle Ages, the explanation for these tragedies began to take a far more sinister and deadly turn. The leap from she is sinful to she is in league with the devil was terrifyingly small and would fuel one of the most brutal chapters in European history. The turning point came in 1487 with the publication of a book that has been called the most evil text ever written, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. Written by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, this book became the official manual for witch hunters across Europe. It was a detailed, systematic guide to identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches. And at the very heart of its twisted logic was the issue of women's reproductive power. The Hammer witches made an explicit and horrifying claim. Midwives and women who experienced repeated miscarriages were often witches. It argued that these women had made pacts with the devil, and in exchange for supernatural powers, they served him by preventing new Christian souls from being born. Satan's foot soldiers in his war against God. A woman who repeatedly failed to produce a healthy child was no longer just a sinner. She was a potential agent of hell, actively working to destroy Christendom from within. This book gave authorities a theological and legal justification they needed to turn a personal tragedy into a capital crime. A woman's reproductive history became evidence in a court of law. Let's consider the story of Katharina Hennet, a respected and wealthy woman from Cologne, Germany. In the early 1600s, Katharina, who had suffered several miscarriages and stillbirths, was accused of witchcraft. Her accusers, armed with the logic of the Malleus Maleficarum, built their case around her body's failures. Witnesses were brought forward to testify. A neighbor claimed that after a dispute, her cow had stopped giving milk, a classic sign of a witch's curse. Another testified that Katharina seemed to grieve unnaturally after her losses, suggesting her sorrow was not for the lost child, but for a failed demonic mission. The most damning evidence was her association with a local midwife who used herbal remedies. The midwife's practical knowledge was reframed as black magic, and Katharina was her accomplice. Under brutal torture, a common practice in witch trials, Katharina confessed to everything. She admitted to making a pact with the devil, to causing storms, and to using her demonic powers to kill her own unborn children. In 1627, Katharina Hennet was burned at the stake. Her story became a terrifying blueprint, repeated thousands of times across Europe. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of people, the vast majority of whom were women, were executed for witchcraft during this period. Many of these accusations were rooted in reproductive anxieties, infertility, miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant death. The witch hunts created a terrifying cascade of paranoia. One woman's miscarriage could trigger a chain reaction of accusations. Imagine Elizabeth, a merchant's wife, perhaps owing her husband money or simply holding a grudge, whispers to the local priest that Elizabeth had been seen speaking with an old widow named Margot, who lived at the edge of the forest. She confesses to cursing Elizabeth's womb and, to save herself from further pain, names other women in the village as her accomplices, women who had sought her help for menstrual cramps or difficult pregnancies. The entire village is consumed by a frenzy of accusation and death, all stemming from one tragic natural event. This was the ultimate weaponization of women's bodies. The very knowledge that had been passed down through generations to help women survive the perils of childbirth was now proof of demonic collaboration. Midwives were in an impossible position. If a birth went well, they might be praised. But if the mother or baby died, a tragically common occurrence, the midwife was an easy scapegoat. She had mysterious knowledge, and she could be blamed for a tragedy that no one understood. The witch hunts were not just about religious hysteria. They were about destroying female knowledge and power, and solidifying control of male religious and medical authorities once and for all. A queen's womb on trial, power, politics, and pregnancy loss. You might think that wealth and power could protect a woman from this nightmare. Surrounded by the best physicians and protected by royal authority, would be immune to the culture of blame. When miscarriage entered the halls of power, it didn't just destroy a woman's reputation. It could topple dynasties, shatter alliances, and change the course of world history. The most famous example is the tragic story of Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of King Henry VIII of England. Catherine was a Spanish princess, intelligent, pious, and deeply in love with her husband. Her duty as queen was clear, to provide a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. For 20 years, Catherine tried to fulfill this duty, but her body was plagued by a heartbreaking series of reproductive tragedies. She endured at least 6 pregnancies. One daughter, Mary, survived, but there were stillborn children, sons who died within weeks of birth, and devastating miscarriages. In a different context, this would be seen as a profound personal tragedy. But for a king obsessed with his legacy, it was a political crisis. And in a world steeped in the belief that a woman's womb was a reflection of her soul, it became a theological one. Henry VIII, desperate for a son and infatuated with a younger woman in Bullen, began to publicly frame Catherine's miscarriages as a sign of God's wrath. He and his advisors constructed an elaborate argument citing a passage from the Old Testament book of Leviticus that said a man who marries his brother's widow will be childless. Catherine had been briefly married to Henry's older brother. Henry claimed that their marriage was therefore incestuous in the eyes of God, and that Catherine's barren womb, her inability to produce a living son, was a divine punishment. Catherine's reproductive history was put on trial before all of Europe. Her body became a political battlefield. Every miscarriage was dissected and debated by theologians, lawyers, and ambassadors. The king's physicians were called to testify, not about medicine, but about theology. They argued that because Catherine was healthy and received the best care, her repeated losses couldn't be natural, a clear sign of God's displeasure. Imagine the humiliation and pain. A queen, a devout Catholic, forced to listen as the most powerful men in her kingdom publicly debated the state of her womb and her soul. She was accused of being cursed, of being a spiritual obstacle to the future of England. Catherine fought back with incredible courage and dignity. She argued that her first marriage had never been consummated, and that the Pope himself had granted a dispensation for her to marry Henry. She insisted she was a true and rightful queen. But in a world where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to produce male heirs, her arguments fell on deaf ears. Her body had failed, and in the eyes of her husband and his court, that failure was her ultimate crime. Henry's obsession with an heir and his conviction that Catherine was cursed led him to break with the Catholic Church, a seismic event that triggered the English Reformation and reshaped the religious and political landscape of Europe forever. Catherine was cast aside, separated from her daughter, and forced to live out her final years in isolation, still insisting she was a true queen. Her story is the ultimate example of how the medieval system of blame worked. It shows that no amount of wealth, status, or piety could protect a woman from being reduced to her reproductive function. If a queen's miscarriages could be used to justify a religious revolution, what hope did an ordinary village woman have? Catherine's tragedy revealed the terrifying truth. In the medieval world, a woman's womb did not belong to her. It belonged to her husband, her family, and her God. And if it failed to perform its duty, she alone would pay the price. The echoes in the mirror, how the past haunts the present. As we leave the Dark Ages behind, it's tempting to believe that this cruel history is just that. We no longer burn women as witches or blame miscarriage on the evil eye. We have science, medicine, and a supposedly enlightened understanding of the human body. If we listen closely, we can still hear the faint, chilling echoes of these medieval beliefs in our modern world. The shadow of blame, though fainter, has not disappeared entirely. Think about the language we still use. When a woman has a miscarriage, one of the first questions people often ask, sometimes with the best intentions, is why? The underlying implication is that there must be a reason, a cause that can be identified. This search for a reason often turns inward, leading the woman to endlessly replay the weeks leading up to her loss. Was it that glass of wine I had before I knew I was pregnant? Was I too stressed at work? Did I exercise too much? This internal interrogation is a modern reflection of the medieval conviction that the woman must have done something wrong. Modern science tells us that the vast majority of early miscarriages are caused by random chromosomal abnormalities, events that are completely out of anyone's control. Yet the feeling of personal failure and guilt persists, a cultural inheritance from a time when that guilt was officially assigned. The silence and shame that still surround miscarriage are another powerful legacy. Many women are advised not to announce a pregnancy until after the first trimester, the period of highest risk. The unspoken message is, keep it quiet, just in case something goes wrong. This turns miscarriage into a private, hidden grief. Instead of being surrounded by a supportive community, and their partners suffer in isolation, feeling that their loss is a shameful secret that shouldn't be shared. This mirrors a medieval practice of shunning women who miscarried, treating them as if they were unclean or bearers of bad luck. Even within the medical community, the echoes remain. For centuries, medicine has been a field dominated by male perspectives. Things are changing. There is a long history of women's health concerns being dismissed or downplayed. Women who report severe pain are sometimes told they are being emotional or exaggerating. Conditions like endometriosis or polycystic ovary syndrome can go undiagnosed for years. This subtle dismissal of women's experiences of their own bodies is a direct descendant of a medical system that once believed women were inherently flawed, irrational, and unreliable narrators of their own health. But here is where the story turns towards hope. We are finally beginning to break the cycle. The most powerful tool we have is the very thing medieval women were denied: knowledge. We now understand the complex biology of pregnancy. We can identify genetic, hormonal, and anatomical reasons for loss. This knowledge is a powerful antidote to blame. It allows us to say with scientific certainty, this was not your fault. And just as importantly, we are breaking the silence. Online communities and social media have given women a platform to share their stories of loss openly and without shame. Campaigns like #IADMiscarriage are connecting millions of people, creating the supportive networks that medieval women were so cruelly denied. Women are discovering they are not alone, that their grief is valid, and that their experiences matter. We are seeing changes in our laws and workplaces, with some countries and companies now recognizing miscarriage as a legitimate reason for bereavement leave. This acknowledges the loss not as a private failure, but as a significant life event deserving of compassion and support. The story of how women were blamed for miscarriage is a dark and painful one. It's a story of ignorance, fear, and the abuse of power. It shows us what can happen when a society decides to turn a natural part of the human experience into a weapon against half its population. But it is also, ultimately, a story of resilience. It is a story of the quiet wisdom of midwives who never stopped caring, of women who found ways to support each other in secret, and the slow, hard-won march of scientific knowledge and human compassion. The journey is not over. Every time we respond to a friend's loss with quiet support instead of probing questions, every time we challenge the notion that miscarriage is a taboo topic, every time we advocate for better research and care, we are actively dismantling the legacy of this dark history. We are choosing compassion over condemnation and empathy over blame. Thank you for walking with me through this difficult but vital history. The stories of these women deserve to be told, not to dwell in the darkness, but to better understand the light we are all striving towards. If their story has touched you, please help it reach others. Share this video and join the conversation in the comments below. Let us know where you're watching from and what this story made you feel. By connecting with each other, we build the compassionate community that these women were denied. Subscribe to join us for more journeys into the stories that shaped our world. Until next time, take care of each other